June 17, 1944. The mountainous terrain of central Italy, 20 kilometers northeast of Perugia. Private First Class Chester Yazzie crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, his fingers reading the disturbed earth like a book written in a language only he understood. The German forces controlling this region had no idea that the skills honed tracking deer and coyote across the Navajo Nation would soon orchestrate their complete tactical collapse. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a simple reconnaissance mission would transform into one of the most ingenious deceptions of the Italian campaign, proving that centuries-old tracking wisdom could outsmart modern military doctrine. Chester Yazzie was not supposed to be here. The 23-year-old from Chinle, Arizona had enlisted in 1942, one of the few Native American soldiers assigned to the 36th Infantry Division. Unlike the famous code talkers serving in the Pacific, Chester's contribution to the effort would come from skills passed down through generations of his family, hunters who could read the desert and mountains as easily as most men read newspapers. Sergeant Thomas Mallory, a career soldier from Pennsylvania with 15 years of service, watched Chester work with growing fascination. The young private moved across the rocky slope with methodical precision, occasionally pausing to examine crushed vegetation or displaced stones. Mallory spoke quietly. "This is the third patrol route you have mapped in 2 days. Command is impressed, but they want to know if you are certain about the patterns." Chester did not look up from his examination of a boot print pressed into soft earth between two rocks. The German forces move supplies every 72 hours. Same routes, same times. They think the mountains protect them, make them unpredictable, but the land remembers everything. The intelligence Chester had gathered over 6 weeks of careful observation painted a clear picture. The German defensive positions in this sector relied on 3 primary supply routes threading through the Apennine foothills. Each route featured natural choke points where steep terrain funneled movement into predictable corridors. Standard military thinking would suggest randomizing these routes, but the German commanders, confident in their mountain stronghold, had settled into a comfortable pattern. Captain James Whitmore, the battalion intelligence officer, studied the hand-drawn maps Chester had created during his nighttime reconnaissance missions. Each map featured details no aerial photograph could capture: the texture of specific paths, the places where rocky ground gave way to soft earth, the sheltered areas where men would naturally pause to rest. Whitmore addressed the assembled officers. "Private Yazzie has identified what he believes is an opportunity. The German forces have established such consistent patterns that he thinks we can manipulate their entire supply network. I will let him explain." Chester stood before the maps, uncomfortable with the attention, but confident in his observations. "My grandfather taught me that the best way to control where an animal goes is to make it think it is choosing its own path. The German forces use these 3 routes because they are the easiest paths through difficult terrain. But there is a 4th route, one they have ignored because it appears too challenging." He pointed to a narrow valley cutting through a particularly steep section of mountains. "This path is harder, more exposed in places, but it is actually shorter than their current routes by almost 5 kilometers. If we make their regular routes appear compromised, they will look for alternatives. And when they do, they will find this valley. They will think they discovered it themselves." The concept was audacious. Rather than ambushing the German forces on their established routes, Chester proposed manipulating them into choosing a different path entirely, one where American forces could control every advantage. Colonel Robert Harrison, battalion commander, leaned forward. "You want to herd them like cattle. Make them think they are outsmarting us, while we are driving them exactly where we want them." Chester nodded. "The land does most of the work. We just need to leave the right signs." Over the next 4 days, Chester orchestrated what would become a masterclass in tactical deception. Working with a hand-picked team of 8 soldiers, he began leaving carefully crafted evidence of American activity along the German supply routes. The deception required precision that seemed almost impossibly detailed. Along the easternmost route, Chester's team left boot prints suggesting a platoon-sized reconnaissance unit had recently passed through. But these were not random tracks. Chester placed them in patterns that would appear to German scouts as attempts at concealment that had not quite succeeded. Private Danny Sullivan from Boston, one of Chester's team members, watched in amazement as the tracker knelt beside a small stream crossing. Chester carefully disturbed the stream bank in a way that looked like someone had tried to cross without leaving traces, but had failed. He then placed a nearly invisible tripwire made from fishing line across the path, positioned so low that it would not stop anyone but would certainly be discovered by careful scouts. Sullivan whispered his confusion. "We want them to find our positions?" Chester shook his head slightly. "We want them to think they found our positions. There is a difference. On the central route, the deception became more elaborate. Chester's team prepared a false observation post overlooking a key stretch of the trail. They left behind deliberately abandoned items, an empty ration tin with a manufacturing date from the previous week, a discarded cigarette pack of the brand issued to American forces, even a torn page from a training manual. Each item told a story of careless soldiers who had revealed their position. The real artistry came in how Chester made the evidence appear discovered rather than planted. He understood that German scouts, like any good trackers, would be suspicious of anything too obvious. So he buried some items partially in soil, scattered others under vegetation, created layers of time and weather exposure that would feel authentic. Corporal Michael Chen, a Nisei soldier from California, who had joined the team specifically for this operation, marveled at the attention to detail. "My family farms outside Sacramento. My father always said you can read the land if you pay attention, but this is something else entirely." Chester responded while carefully arranging stones to suggest someone had sat watching the trail below. "Your father is right, but tracking is not just reading what is there. Sometimes it is writing what you want others to read." The third route received the most elaborate treatment. Here Chester created evidence of a full company preparing defensive positions. Shallow scrapes in the earth suggested foxholes hastily started, then abandoned. Branches broken at specific heights indicated where communication wire might have been strung. Small disturbances in the soil marked where stakes for camouflage netting could have been placed. Lieutenant Robert Jensen, the platoon leader overseeing this phase of the operation, radioed back to command with barely contained excitement. "Sir, if I did not know this was fake, I would swear a full rifle company had been preparing positions here for days. How is this possible?" Chester's voice came through the radio, calm and matter-of-fact. "People always leave more traces than they realize. I'm just leaving the traces that tell the story we want told." But the most crucial element of the deception was what Chester called the revelation, the moment when the German forces would discover what they believed was a secret. Working at night, he identified the fourth route through the narrow valley, the path he intended the German forces to take. Then he made it look like someone had tried very hard to keep it hidden. He placed barely visible markers that suggested American scouts had considered this route, but rejected it as too exposed. He left a single set of boot prints leading into the valley, then returning, as if someone had explored the option and decided against it. Most ingeniously, he created subtle signs that American forces had deliberately tried to make the valley appear more difficult than it actually was. Small rock piles that looked like natural formations, but were positioned to discourage passage. Vegetation bent to suggest recent rock slides that had not actually occurred. Sergeant Mallory, watching Chester work, finally understood the brilliance of the plan. "You are making them think we are hiding the fact that this route is dangerous. So when they investigate and discover it is actually passable, they will believe they have found our mistake." Chester allowed himself a small smile. "My uncle once told me the easiest person to deceive is someone who thinks they are being clever. The German commanders will send scouts. The scouts will find all our false positions on the regular routes. Then they will find this valley and think they have outsmarted us." The psychological dimension of the operation extended beyond simple misdirection. Chester understood that the German forces, having held these mountains for months, would have developed confidence in their knowledge of the terrain. By appearing to make mistakes that played into that confidence, he was essentially feeding their assumptions. Captain Whitmore coordinated the next phase, positioning actual American forces to support the deception. Small teams established genuine observation posts with clear views of the valley route, positioned not to ambush but to be seen. When German scouts inevitably surveilled the area before committing forces, They would spot these American positions and factor them into their planning, never realizing they were seeing exactly what Chester wanted them to see. The waiting began. For 6 days, American forces maintained absolute discipline, avoiding any activity that might disrupt the careful narrative Chester had constructed. Patrols stayed away from the marked routes. Radio traffic followed predetermined scripts, designed to suggest American forces were preparing defensive operations rather than an ambush. On June 24th, German scouts discovered the tripwire on the eastern route. Intercepted radio communications, translated by the battalion's German-speaking intelligence team, indicated the scouts had reported signs of American reconnaissance activity. The tone suggested satisfaction, a belief they had detected enemy movements before those movements could threaten German operations. 2 days later, scouts found the false observation post on the central route. This discovery generated more extensive radio traffic. The German commanders were clearly discussing the implications of what appeared to be American forces establishing defensive positions throughout the region. Chester listened to the translated intercepts with Lieutenant Jensen. They are exactly where we need them to be. Confused enough to look for alternatives, but not so alarmed they abandoned the sector entirely. On June 27, a German reconnaissance team explored the valley route. American observers, hidden in positions Chester had selected weeks earlier, watched through binoculars as 4 German soldiers carefully worked their way through the narrow defile. The scouts moved cautiously, clearly expecting the route to be more difficult than it appeared. Their body language suggested surprise when they discovered the passage was actually quite manageable for supply vehicles. The scouts spent 3 hours examining the route, and their thoroughness told Chester everything he needed to know. They were not just exploring, they were evaluating. That evening, intercepted communications confirmed what Chester had predicted. The German commanders had decided to shift their primary supply route to the valley, believing they had discovered a path that American forces either did not know about or had dismissed as unusable. Colonel Harrison assembled his command staff. "Private Yazzie, your assessment was correct. They are taking the bait. Now we need to ensure the trap is perfect." The valley Chester had selected offered advantages that became apparent only through intimate knowledge of the terrain. At its narrowest point, steep walls rose 30 meters on both sides, creating a natural corridor barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. The valley floor, while appearing smooth, featured soft earth that would slow heavily loaded trucks. Most critically, the valley bent sharply after 800 meters, meaning anyone entering could not see the full length of the route until they were committed. American forces moved into position with the same careful precision Chester had used in creating the deception. Machine gun teams established positions on the valley walls with overlapping fields of fire. Mortar crews ranged the entire length of the corridor. Bangalore torpedoes were prepared to block the valley exit once German forces entered. Every position was camouflaged, not just to hide from ground observation, but from the specific angles German scouts had used during their reconnaissance. Private First Class Robert Thompson from Georgia, positioning his machine gun among rocks on the valley wall, marveled at how Chester had anticipated every detail. "This position has perfect sight lines down the entire corridor. How did you know exactly where to put us?" Chester, making final adjustments to camouflage netting, responded quietly. "I walked this valley 6 times at different times of day. I know where the shadows fall, where the sun reflects, where someone walking below would look and where they would not. You are in a place that does not exist from their perspective." The human element of the operation weighed on Chester in ways he had not anticipated. He found himself thinking about the German soldiers who would enter the valley, men who believed they had found a clever solution to a tactical problem. They would be following orders, trusting their scouts, doing exactly what soldiers are supposed to do. And because of trails he had created and stories he had written in disturbed earth and broken branches, they would walk into a situation from which many would not emerge. Sergeant Mallory, sensing Chester's mood, sat beside him the night before the expected German movement. "You did not create this situation. The conflict exists whether you use your skills or not. But because of what you have done, American soldiers in this battalion will face less danger. That matters." Chester nodded slowly. "My grandfather said every gift comes with responsibility. Tracking was given to our people to help us survive, to feed our families, to understand the world around us. Using it this way feels like changing something sacred. Mallory considered this thoughtfully. Maybe you are not changing it. Maybe you are using the same skills for the same purpose, survival. Just the scale is different. On the morning of June 29, German supply vehicles began entering the valley. American observers counted 7 trucks, 2 motorcycles, and approximately 300 soldiers serving as escorts and security. The column moved with practiced efficiency, soldiers walking in formation alongside the vehicles, weapons ready but not aimed, alert but not alarmed. Colonel Harrison, watching through field glasses from a concealed command post, spoke into his radio. "All units hold fire. Wait for my command. Let the entire column commit to the valley." The German forces proceeded exactly as Chester had predicted. The lead elements reached the valley bend and paused while scouts moved ahead to check the continuation of the route. Satisfied that the path remained clear, the column resumed movement. Within 20 minutes, the entire German force was stretched along 800 meters of the narrow valley, with the lead vehicles approaching the far end and the rear guard just entering. Chester, positioned with the command group, watched the scene unfold with mixed emotions. The precision of the prediction should have felt satisfying, but instead he felt only a heavy awareness of what would come next. Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the radio silence. "All units on my mark. 3, 2, 1, execute." What happened next occurred with devastating efficiency. Bangalore torpedoes detonated at both ends of the valley, creating rock slides that sealed the exits. Mortar rounds began falling with precision that came from weeks of range calculation. Machine gun fire swept the valley floor from positions the German forces had not known existed. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. When silence returned to the valley, over 200 German soldiers had been taken into custody. The supply vehicles were disabled, and the entire logistical operation for this sector had been disrupted. American casualties were 3 wounded, none seriously. But the true impact extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. German commanders in the region, realizing their supply routes had been completely compromised and their tactical assumptions had been manipulated, began a withdrawal from positions they had held for months. The intelligence failure, the discovery that their movements had been not just observed but orchestrated, created a crisis of confidence that affected decision-making across the entire sector. In the days following the operation, Chester's role became widely known throughout the division. Soldiers who had never heard of the Navajo Nation suddenly wanted to know about tracking, about reading terrain, about the skills that had made the operation possible. For Chester, the attention was uncomfortable. A violation of the quiet observation that made tracking effective. Lieutenant Jensen, who had become something of a student of Chester's methods, asked the question many were thinking. How much of what happened was planning, and how much was luck? Chester considered the question carefully. "My grandfather would say there is no luck, only preparation meeting opportunity. I could read the land and understand the patterns because I spent time learning. The German forces followed the path I created because I understood what they would look for. But whether that makes it planning or something else, I am not certain." The broader implications of the operation reached beyond military tactics. Chester's success demonstrated that traditional knowledge, skills developed over centuries for entirely different purposes, could adapt to modern challenges in ways that conventional military training could not anticipate. His approach had not relied on superior firepower or technology, but on understanding human nature and the relationship between people and landscape. Captain Whitmore included a detailed analysis of the operation in his after-action report. The success of this engagement relied primarily on the application of tracking and observation skills that are not part of standard military training. Private Yazzie demonstrated that understanding terrain at an intimate level, combined with insight into how soldiers interact with landscape, can create tactical opportunities that conventional reconnaissance might miss. His ability to construct a believable deception by thinking like both the hunter and the hunted represents a valuable capability that should be studied and, where possible, replicated. The report made its way up the command chain, eventually reaching officers who began considering how traditional skills from various cultures might contribute to military effectiveness. While Chester would never know the full extent of his influence, the operation in the Italian mountains helped open discussions about incorporating diverse knowledge bases into tactical planning. For Chester himself, the experience reinforced lessons his grandfather had taught him years earlier in the high desert of Arizona. The land speaks to those who listen. Patterns exist in all things. Understanding comes not from imposing your will on the world, but from observing carefully and working with what is already there. Sergeant Mallory, in a quiet moment after the operation, shared his own reflection. "I have been a soldier for 15 years. I have seen brilliant tactical planning and brave men doing remarkable things. But what you did was different. You changed the battlefield before the engagement even began. You made the enemy choose the ground of their own defeat. That is something I have never witnessed before." The months following the Valley operation saw Chester continue serving with the 36th Division as they advanced through Italy. His tracking skills were employed in reconnaissance missions, helping identify enemy positions and movement patterns. But the elaborate deception of the Valley remained unique, a perfect alignment of skills, opportunity, and tactical necessity that could not be easily repeated. In August of 1944, Chester received a field promotion to corporal in recognition of his contributions. The promotion came with a citation that carefully avoided specifics but acknowledged his exceptional service. For Chester, the recognition mattered less than a letter he received from his grandfather, somehow delivered through the military postal system, despite the old man's general distrust of official institutions. The letter, written in English by a trading post operator who knew the family, conveyed his grandfather's words. "You have used the gifts given to our people in a way that honors both the old ways and your duty to your brothers in arms. The ancestors would approve. Remember that tracking is not about domination, but about understanding. You have understood well." Chester carried that letter through the remainder of the campaign in Italy and later through occupation duty in Germany. When he finally returned to Arizona in 1946, he brought with him stories he would share selectively and lessons he would integrate into the traditional knowledge he would eventually pass to his own children and grandchildren. The tactical deception in the Italian mountains became a case study in several military intelligence courses in the years following the conflict. Analysis focused on the psychological elements of the operation, how preconceptions could be exploited, how careful observation could reveal patterns others might miss, how traditional skills could adapt to modern challenges. But perhaps the most significant impact was personal rather than institutional. The dozens of American soldiers who witnessed Chester's work, who saw how deep understanding of terrain and human nature could shape outcomes, carried those lessons into their post-military lives. Some became hunters who approached the activity with new respect for traditional methods. Others entered careers in forestry, land management, or conservation with enhanced appreciation for observation and patience. Private Danny Sullivan, who had questioned Chester's methods during the initial phases of the deception, returned to Boston and eventually became a teacher. He would sometimes tell his students about a young man from Arizona who could read stories in disturbed earth and write narratives that changed the course of operations. The lesson was never about military tactics, but about the value of different ways of knowing, different perspectives on the same reality. The valley itself returned to quiet after the engagement. Local Italian farmers, who had avoided the area during the German occupation, gradually reclaimed the land. In time, the evidence of what had occurred faded, absorbed back into the landscape. But the lessons learned in that narrow corridor about deception and observation, about traditional wisdom meeting modern challenges, about the power of understanding both land and human nature, those lessons persisted. Chester Yazzie returned to Chinle and resumed the life that had been interrupted by the conflict. He raised sheep, participated in community ceremonies, and taught his children and grandchildren the tracking skills that had served him across 2 continents. He spoke rarely of his military service, deflecting questions with the modesty common among his generation of veterans. But sometimes, walking the high desert country of his youth, he would pause to examine disturbed earth or broken vegetation, and a small smile would cross his face. The land still spoke to him in the language he had learned as a child, and he understood with quiet satisfaction that those skills, honed over countless generations for survival and sustenance, had proven their worth in ways his ancestors could never have imagined, but would certainly have approved. The story of the Valley operation eventually faded from official memory, buried in classified reports and aging file cabinets. But the principle Chester demonstrated, that observation and understanding could be more powerful than firepower, that traditional knowledge could solve modern problems, that seeing the world differently could change outcomes, those principles remained relevant long after the specific tactical details ceased to matter. In the end, Chester's greatest contribution may have been the reminder that wisdom comes in many forms, that skills developed for one purpose can adapt to serve others, and that understanding, whether applied to tracking game across desert or anticipating enemy movements through mountains, remains among the most valuable of human capabilities. The land speaks to those who listen, teaches those who observe, and offers advantages to those who understand its language. Chester Yazzie understood this truth deeply, and for 17 minutes in a narrow Italian valley, that understanding changed everything, and that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.